good evening, and what better location for a discussion about death than this rather moribund location? No, this highly ethical location in which many, many conversations about ethics have been held over the years. It's a great pleasure to be here with Atul, and his book, if you haven't read it, is very moving. And I suppose the first question I wanted to ask you really was a more general question about how you see yourself. I mean, there is a long tradition of writer-doctors. One thinks of Chekhov immediately. Did the two vocations come hand in hand to you?
I was late to becoming a writer. I was early to becoming a doctor. So I'm the son of two Indian doctors, and it almost is written in your blood that you must then therefore become an Indian doctor. I tried to escape it. I spent time at Oxford studying philosophy, politics, economics. I worked in politics. I worked on the Al Gore campaign when he ran for president in 1988. No one remembers that campaign ended because it was disclosed that he had smoked pot in college, and that was enough to end the campaign back in '88. And therefore, that political role I had. But eventually, I worked in the Clinton administration. And it was never quite out of my blood that I was going to end up doing medicine, and I did end up there. In writing, it was never going to be something that seemed likely in the cards for me. I got my lowest grade at Stanford College. I was at college at Stanford University. My lowest grade was in writing. It was a C. And if you know anything about Stanford, you know how hard it is to get a C in anything. But later, in the middle of my surgical training, a friend of mine started an internet magazine, and no one would write for this internet magazine at the time. And so he asked his friends to write for it. And he was a phenomenal editor. And I wrote about 30 columns over a year and a half. I learned a lot. He would tell me, work on this, do less of that. His colleagues would edit me. And it was like doing 30 gallbladders in a row when I was in surgical training. You learn how to do it. And so at the end of it, I got offered a position at the New Yorker, unexpectedly during my residency training.
Mm. Do you think there are any affinities between writing and surgery specifically?
I think there are a lot, actually. I'm really struck by the way that a writer, and I read you closely, and there's a kind of a little bit of inhumanity behind it, right? A sense of observing and pinning it to the wall, enjoying a little bit of the gruesomeness. I mean, when I got attracted to surgery, I kind of did like the blood and guts of it all. I loved the skill and getting to deal with it, but then you have to step back and remember you do have this human being that's part of this picture. And I think the writer has to be able to navigate between these two worlds the same way a doctor does. The doctor has to at moments forget the human being and remember the detail, and yet pull back and remember the bigger picture.
So it's sort of between the technical stroke impersonal and the personal and ethical on the other hand. And because I'm intrigued by surgery in terms of kind of squeamishness. We all know about doctors' training. We all know you're kind of thrown in at the deep end. You have to do dissection from the get-go. Was that when you found the surgical vocation, when you were faced with your first cadaver and you told to cut it up?
Right. It was not when I had my first cadaver. I still was thinking about a career where I would do something that would fit very straightforwardly with a life in healthcare policy and politics, because that had been what I was doing before. And then when I went into an operating room in my third year of training, that was where the unexpected thing happened, which was, I think some people go to the operating room and want to turn away, and other people, it draws them in, and I was completely drawn in. I was drawn in by the amazement of opening up people's bodies and seeing inside them, but then also the human beings. I mean, a surgeon was someone who understood that knowledge is limited, that our capabilities are fallible, that they're not perfect, that their skills are, always going to have limits to them, And yet, it pays in surgery to take action instead of just inaction. You proceed, you live with the consequences, good or bad. You have to take responsibility for them. And I love that sense of character that the best surgeons seem to have, that they would take a feeling of, they had confidence and responsibility. And I kind of wanted to be that person. And I wasn't necessarily that person, but I was drawn in. It was in many ways like the politicians that I knew, that they could deal with uncertainty, make decisions, take action, and then, if they were good, they were living with the consequences.
I suppose I noted looking at your biography, I suppose I did see that kind of mismatch between your interest in public health and your work as a surgeon, because you would have assumed with that background in politics, you have this degree in PPE from Oxford, working on these political campaigns, interest in public health, that you might have gone into epidemiology, social health issues of one kind or another. But it seems to be a kind of sense of heroism, dare I say it, around surgery, because it is the most dramatic medical action, isn't it?
Yeah, there is this a juvenile thrust to wanting to go into the field. You want to be the hero.
But what you say about finitude, and you write about this in Being Mortal, about your worries that the problem for the medical profession is a failure to realize its own finitude, a kind of addiction to this Promethean view of the profession, that it's not just going to steal fire from the gods, but it actually could steal immortality.
Well, and then when you discover, as I discovered after I got out of medical school, went into training, that you were in fact spending a significant part of your time dealing with moments where you were not going to save the day. Chronic illness, you have someone who's elderly, becoming frail, and that path isn't changing. Your ideal is the 24-year-old who's sick with an appendicitis, and an hour later they've come out because you've taken out that appendix. They could have died, and you have saved the day. I mean, that is a wonderful feeling. Well, what about the terminally ill patient who comes in with a problem that you make a last-ditch effort, and all you've done is make it worse? And I was experiencing that and seeing that happen again and again. And that violates our ideas of what being a hero really is.
You write about one particular patient in Being Mortal, where you're in that situation, and you describe the operation as a palliative operation, which is a sort of oxymoron in a way. And it's in many ways one of the most harrowing passages in the book. I wondered if it was experiences like that had driven you to particularly consider end-of-life situations in relation to medicine.
That particular case was one that felt like the end point of being drawn in. That is, early in the book I described some of my first experiences with people who died. And one in particular, a guy now who I called Joseph Lazaroff, had come in with, he had had a couple years of chemotherapy for metastatic cancer. It had bought him, good time. He lived independently, he was doing well, until he wasn't doing well. And then he was losing weight, he was becoming more and more disabled as the disease spread throughout his body. He was getting malnourished, and no one was quite telling him that, you're weeks to months away from what's happening here. He woke up one day paralyzed, came in emergently, and we said, oh, we'll try to fix that. And we offered him, well, you could do surgery, and we could try to take out this tumor that's causing you to be paralyzed, or you could just, we'll just keep you comfortable, and, your other choice is that you'll just die. But the implication was that we would be saving him in some way, maybe buying more time. And instead, what we did was technically successful. We took out the tumor. The problem that was extending his paralysis was gone. Now, it wouldn't make his paralysis better. And to do this, we had to go in through his chest, and he was so emaciated and weak that he never got off the ventilator. Spent 2 weeks in the ICU. We just getting worse and worse. I was putting in a chest tube one day. I was having to put in a feeding tube the next day. It was just misery for him. And then, the family finally said, enough is enough. I took him off the ventilator and listened to his heart go away. And after doing that many times and finding that we had not, that I wasn't being very successful in navigating this path, and then I described partway through the book my own father, who's a surgeon, getting a brain tumor in his brain stem and spinal cord that we knew we would not be able to cure. That led me to ask, what are the different pathways? So by the time we get to that patient who came in with a bowel obstruction from an ovarian cancer, I'd seen lots of patients like that. And I would always take them to surgery saying, well, you can't eat, so surely we should try something, and make them worse. And instead, this time, managed to ask her the kinds of questions that I found people who are really good at managing this situation were good at. And they would just ask, well, a few questions. What's your understanding of where you are? What are your fears and what are your worries? What are your goals if time is short? What outcomes are unacceptable to you? And her answer to these questions was, I know I'm dying. I don't know when, but I feel myself diminishing every week. And her fears and worries were, well, this bowel is being blocked by this tumor. I'm throwing up. I'm miserable. Her fear is that she would just be throwing up and miserable for the last period of her days. Her fear is she wouldn't eat again. Her fear is she would never leave the hospital. And the outcomes that were unacceptable to her were never getting to leave the hospital. And so we fashioned an operation together that said, I'm going to go in, I'm going to try to unblock this tumor, but if I do not have a way that I cannot make you feel better within 24 to 48 hours after this operation, then I won't keep on going. I will just do the things that make you feel better. I got in and found the tumor was worse than I expected. It was like a cake of tumor encasing all of her bowel. And so the only thing I could do was put a tube in the bowel to drain it out and a tube in her stomach to drain it out. Close her up. Now the tube was her salvation. Every time she got nauseated, she opened the tube and it would drain out. And she went home for a couple weeks of being at home, spending time with family, and then passed away. Getting to that point and feeling like you could feel good doing that. In fact, feeling like I'd been competent and had a victory, that's what took a long time. I mean,
not to give the impression that the book is loaded with statistics, but one that seems to feed into that very strongly is this stat that 65% of doctors overestimate the life expectancy of terminally ill patients. And the other statistic that I think is highly significant is the life expectancy of patients who accept palliative care is actually longer than those who don't. So in other words, the patient who's sitting there saying, do whatever you can, Dr. Gawande, I don't care, is actually not in good shape to deal with things.
That fourth round of chemotherapy, when you're doing it as a last-ditch maneuver, you get all the toxicity, none of the benefit. Now, that doesn't mean you don't want the first round when you have a chance of it doing something very good for you. But we're in a place where, where the failure to be able to help elicit what people's priorities and goals are before they come to that point leads you to this place where you say, well, then we must do something. And what we do, you're exactly right. We not only make them have more suffering, we also shorten their lives, which is precisely the opposite of their goal.
What you describe, particularly in the States, is a situation in which people towards the end of their lives are essentially kind of fodder for insurance companies. These things are being decided on an actuarial basis, in a sense, and that kind of rubric is coming to dominate people's thinking. And I believe I'm right about this. One of the kind of famous articles you did for the New Yorker was looking at the impact of different, and you were actually involved under the Clinton administration with trying to develop a kind of proto-form of socialized medicine for America. I wondered whether you had looked, because of course we have socialized medicine here, or did, whether you've ever looked at outcomes and this kind of relationship between palliative care and kind of give it another round of chemo in the kind of context we have here.
This is a great question. So in my article for the New Yorker, I looked at the most expensive county for healthcare, arguably in the world. We're in the most expensive country for healthcare, and this was the county that had the most expensive care. And it's McAllen, Texas, in the border region of Texas. And I compared it to El Paso, which is right up the border, has the same, they're both equally poor, both equally have difficulties with illegal immigrants. They both equally have, the same number of hospitals, about similar populations, lots of issues with diabetes and high blood pressure and coronary artery disease. And the cost in El Paso is already, the average for America is higher than in the rest of the world. And McAllen, Texas was double that. And what I found when I visited there, and I'd asked the doctor, I said, so why are you the most expensive place in the world? And what they described was a business culture where they simply saw patients and healthcare as a business. And they were maximizing your ability to follow what the business incentive said. And in that system, you were paid a fee for every service, every operation, and so on that you did. And the results are that place just did it uncommonly well. I came away with this depressing idea that the puzzle isn't why McAllen, Texas is so expensive. The puzzle is why the rest of us aren't doing what McAllen, Texas is doing, because there's very little illegal that was going on there. They were just finding a way to make another buck. Now, the fascinating thing, which I didn't write up at that time, is the one you're pointing out. Working with the team of analysts that were helping me look at all the numbers and the data, they came up with a great metric that we called the hospice to ambulance ratio. The amount of spending in the last year of life that went to hospice care over the amount of spending on ambulance rides. And in McAllen, there was more spent on ambulance rides than on hospice care. You went to Portland, Oregon, which is at the opposite end of the spectrum, and it was like 10 times more on hospice care than on ambulance rides. And the fascinating thing is in that population, people didn't live any shorter, they didn't live shorter there. They had less suffering at the end of life. They spent more time in hospice. And people, on the whole, had better satisfaction in their care and how they'd report the healthcare system worked for them. So I do think that there is an element of this where the kind of business mentality of medicine can drive us off the rails. But I caution around the idea that this is only an American phenomenon. In the United States, we were at the end of the 1990s, about 80% of people died in institutions, with only a small percentage who died in their home with hospice care or in hospice centers. And that's true even today in the UK as well. The statistics at the end of the 2000s that are the most recent ones that I have available, 60% of people in Scotland and England die in a hospital. Another 20% in a care home, only a small percentage under hospice care being able to work with people who say, we're going to work on how to give you a good day today. What do you want with the remaining time you have? So do you buy that idea? Do you buy that some of this is actually universal?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always think that we're coming into an election year here, and inevitably the national health will be uppermost. Politicians will be talking about the National Health Service is safe with us. We're not going to privatize, we're not going to reduce funding. This is, I would argue, in terms of domestic policy, is probably the issue that we're most concerned with. But why are we concerned with it? And I think there's another statistic in your book that draws this out. The reality is that the vast amount of money spent on an individual's life is spent in the last year less of that life. And I think we understand that unconsciously. It's never explicitly said. The politicians never stand up and say, vote for me and I'll give you a painless death. Because that's really what they're saying by saying they'll safeguard national health. We all know it. We've all seen loved ones and friends die. We all know what the situation is. We all fear our own end. So this huge anxiety around the national health, it should really be called the National Death Service, because that would more accurately reflect why it is we're so obsessed by it. Okay? So I think it's very germane for our own society. But I wondered, in the book, you discuss these alternative ways rather than this medicalized dying, which seems to be driven by heroic assumptions about what the medical profession can do. And you discuss the hospice movement, you discuss new forms of assisted living that are much more dynamical, that involve older people as integral community members, that in a sense make the last years of people's lives, when they may be invalid to a degree, much more holistically enjoyable for them. And what struck me about your writing about this is that it seems like an alternative conception of a new form of communitarianism. And I was interested that you didn't kind of open it out, because it's almost as if you're sort of suggesting, well, we may live in an anomic society in which the family is becoming weaker and in which wider community ties aren't as effective in supporting us, but maybe we can actually put that into the back end of our lives. I wonder whether you were viewing it in those terms.
It's really interesting to think about. Let me try to connect the dots. I didn't expect to spend 2/3 of the book writing about not dying, but in fact life in frailty or life in dependency. But one of the fundamental lessons that I learned was that the thing that people who are really good at understanding these problems recognize is that people have priorities besides just living longer no matter what. Now, people have different priorities, and in order to learn what those priorities are, the most important thing to do is to ask what people's priorities are, and we don't ask. When you start asking, you start realizing that it's not just at the moment of dying that you have to care about what people's priorities are, but on upstream. And the really important moments are that as you ask people about what matters to them, I introduced this concept of what are your loyalties? What is important to you that's bigger than in your life? And people have loyalties to that they're willing to sacrifice their health and their well-being and their life for family, or maybe for country, or for certain ideals, or for beauty and creativity, or for God. But each person has a different thing that gives them purpose and meaning in life that they'd sacrifice themselves for. That when we enter the medical world, we assume a good life for people is to be healthy and independent. And the modern idea of a good life is I'm healthy and I'm independent. But in fact, we're going to spend somewhere around 1/5 of our lives increasingly less healthy and often not so independent, but in fact needing to be cared for. And that's not just when we're sick in the hospital, but when we are in a wheelchair or need help with taking a bath. And our assumption is it's not possible to have a good life. And yet, there are actual surveys of people as their health diminishes and as their abilities decline. And people in those older phases are actually happier than the rest of us. They're calmer. They have lower levels of depression, lower levels of anxiety, until you put them in a medical institution. And then they are absolutely miserable. What do they ask? They say, when can I go home? They say that even though they've been living in a place for 3 years in a nursing home, And the reason why is that the top priority of those places, they assume your top goal is your health and your safety. As an adult child, you'll bring your parent there and they'll say, this place is safe, and that makes you feel good. But in fact, the life they want to have is one of purpose and meaning, and that means the things they're willing to sacrifice themselves for. So, it can be as mundane as, I'd like to have a drink. Well, that's not safe. Or, I'd like to eat whatever I want. Well, the doctor says you have to eat pureed food, and you'd catch 85-year-old Alzheimer's patients hoarding cookies, and getting written up for violating the food rules. Like you're living in a place where you can get written up. Like, let them have the damn cookies. But the deeper idea is that even things like I wrote about a man in New York who wrote and applied for regulation changes that allowed him to bring animals into nursing homes, animals that could be owned by the people who lived in them. You could have your own dog, you could have your own cat, you could have birds. He brought 100 parakeets into this home, and the regulations said, birds are not allowed, they're not safe. But found that giving people ownership, something to care for bigger than themselves, their death rates fell, their use of antidepressive drugs, drugs against psychosis fell. And the answer isn't that everybody therefore needs a pet. For some people, that's what they want. You may say, a dog's not good enough for me. I want to be able to see some friends.
Just dogs for me, please.
So I think that's what you were getting onto, right?
Yes. I mean, I suppose you draw this interesting distinction, and I think it cuts to the heart of how we existentially experience anxiety about our own mortality, between the remembering self and the experiencing self. And it's quite interesting the way you grow this argument, because you grow it out of the specific study of perception of pain. And you say, actually, what people, when you end a painful procedure with a high level of pain, the patient remembers it as dreadful. But actually, the only 2 points that are really committed to the remembering self are the overall high point of pain and what happened at the end.
Yes.
So if the overall high point of pain isn't that high, even though it's consistently painful as a procedure, and it kind of tails off at the end, they will report that as a good outcome. And out of that argument, you, in a way, turn that round to say that's kind of part of our problem with looking at the business of our own death. The remembering self is also a projecting self, of course. It's an anticipatory self. So what you're pointing towards is our faculty, which is inbuilt in consciousness, of planning in that way. And what you're saying is we have to address these two selves when we look at managing death. Yeah?
Yeah. There are two things that make me think of from this discussion. One is that in this study, part of what they figured out was they took people who were undergoing colonoscopies. This is a nicely gross study, so I get to gross you out here. So they were experiencing colonoscopies without anesthesia. This was a previous time.
Do you have to pay for that?
Yes. And they would have people that have a little dial, and they could rate the level of pain as they're going through this whole thing, and they'd get all the readings about the pain. And in one study, they randomized that half of the patients, at the end of the procedure, the doctor would be told, just leave the colonoscope sitting there in their rectum for about a minute, doing nothing, painlessly. Now, nothing else had changed. But that group who ended on a painless 1 minute remembered it being a much better procedure than everything else. And the parallel I make is, why do we, when we're watching a football match, why is it miserable to us if it's been a blissful hour and a half of the team that we want, winning, but in the last 3 minutes, they completely blow it, and it ends on a horrible note. And we say, it ruined my whole afternoon. The whole thing was ruined. I mean, why is it not crazy to say you had a great 90 minutes and a lousy 3 minutes? And the reason why is because it's a story. It's a story. And the story doesn't have meaning until you come to the end. And the ending gives it that meaning. And what it meant was that you just wasted the whole afternoon because it ended on this horrible point. And that, I think, is like life itself. That what we have to think about is that, the average moment of your life is kind of boring. We sleep for a lot of it. There's a whole lot of stuff that isn't all that meaningful that happens. But what we remember about life are its peaks. Its peaks, both the negative peaks and the positive peaks, and then the endings to certain moments. And that's why dying is such an important ending, but then also this whole period of having to deal with decline. If it's removed and institutionalized, you're not connected to friends, you're not connected to anything of meaning and purpose, you don't play a role in the world. It's just plain, it's both the experiencing self is miserable and the remembering self has nothing to look back on.
Yes, I like that argument. I like the way you developed it. I was utterly convinced.
Until?
by your critique of what we might call, faux demure, kind of heroic medicine in that way. And one of the things that made me think was, is it any surprise that we trust in doctors? You know, I read some of your other surgical writing about, you know, and there's quite a lot in this book as well. And you can do things, I mean, I'm sure this being a sophisticated London audience, it's probably entirely doctors, but those of us who are not doctors simply can't do, let alone surgeons. And if you take a comparable group of professional experts who at one time mediated between mortality and death, the priesthood, your kind of strike rate as doctors, on the face of it, is way better. You know, on the whole, you don't often see miracles performed. People aren't that often raised from the dead, or, you know, it's questionable whether the demons were there to begin with, let alone driven out, and so on and so forth. Whereas we regularly see, you know, I had a little conversation with some friends I was staying with at the weekend, and I'm sure you've all done it before. One person chimes up and says, oh yes, I'm dead. I've been, without medical science, I've been dead 3 times over. My wife said, I'm dead 4 times. I said, I won. I said, I died at birth. I was born with an inguinal hernia I couldn't feed. If I hadn't been born in 1961, but even I would have thought in 1921, I would have been dead. Or when my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer a few years ago, and you know, it was a tricky stage. As we were walking down the steps from seeing the oncologist, I said, how do you feel? She said, lucky. You know, she said, lucky. 10, even 15 years ago, that might have been a death sentence. You know, so the grounds of our faith in medicine are rational. It's not even faith.
Yeah.
But that seems to grow into an irrational faith, doesn't it? It seems to overtake us in that way. But I thought a paradox of you, you're a paradox, is that we listen to you, and I urge everybody to read this book because it's an important book. We listen to you because you're a doctor.
Yeah, criticizing the medicalization of what we're doing.
Yeah. I mean, are you alive to that paradox?
Yes, I get to dwell in it in many ways. I think I get permission to cast a light into our profession. You know, I get to do a job where we have my operations we have 97% success and 3% that go wrong. And I'm really interested, and I tend to obsess about that 3%. You know, I'll have 8, 9, 10 people I make worse off in a year compared to 250, 300 people that I'll make much better off.
And that weighs on your conscience.
Yes, absolutely. Those 10 people, the puzzle is, what could we have done better? Could we have avoided some of these? And the answer is a mix of things. Some of it are avoidable mistakes, and we could have done more and learned more. And some of it is there's limits to what we can do, and we're not dealing with our limits very successfully. So, you know,
So that's how you start Checklist, with the guy getting the potassium concentration wrong in the... Yeah.
Yeah. But I also don't want to suggest that, you know, that everything can be checklisted. And this book is the correction to that, you know, the idea that it will all be within our control. This book is grappling with all of those experiences along the way where you don't have control. And, you know, when my kids get sick, and several have had serious illnesses, I absolutely put my faith in what a group of doctors and nurses can do. But I also know that there are limits to what they can do, some of which is going to drive me crazy because, you know, they're simply not doing basic things like washing hands. And others which are terrifying because they really have everything to do with randomness and chance and the natural order of the world that everything cannot be fixed.
I'm going to throw it open in a second to you, the audience, but before we do, I want to discuss a little bit with you what isn't in the book, or is only slightly in the book. You begin the book by referring to Tolstoy's story, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which I'm sure everybody here has read. And if you haven't, hang your head in shame. I think probably almost the finest bit of writing about dying there probably is.
Absolutely. And about suffering.
And about suffering. If I could fault you a little bit.
Please.
It's not a story about the practicalities of dying at all, is it?
Why?
It's about spirituality and about religious faith. But you treat it as if it's a story. What you concentrate on is the relationship with the servant who will rest poor Ivan Ilyitch's feet on his shoulders and ease his pain. And it's kind of the hospice carer. Mm-hmm. But that's not what the story is about. The story is about a man who realizes when he begins to die that his life has not been a spiritual life. And that's why he suffers so much in dying.
It's a mix, though, isn't it? So at the end, he says, "Forgive me," but of course, no one understands him, and yet he felt peace in being able to ask for that forgiveness. And it clearly is this very religious, metaphysical moment for him because he's lived in a world where he has passed. You know, one of the things that happens is that you live most of your life expecting that you are immortal. And when you become disabled or weak or seriously ill, you realize that your life is finite. And when you do, what you care about changes radically. And I talk about some of that research, that what you care about shifts from getting stuff, having, achieving, getting public recognition. It shifts to wanting to be deeply connected to loved ones, be able to communicate your fears, your worries, your concerns. And when he finds that his wife, his child, the doctors, none will even acknowledge he's dying, let alone share what his suffering is. You know, the servant, I think, also plays a bit of that religious role. It's not clear, is he the priest? Is he even a godlike figure? Is he there as just bearing witness? It's a very powerful role and allows him to achieve that kind of final end where he's found a peace.
But he's not asking the servant. He doesn't say to the servant, "Forgive me." He's saying it to God.
Oh, he's saying it. He says, "Forgive me" to the family, asking them to forgive him. But they don't even understand it. I forget what it comes out as. It comes out as forget. I think it comes out as "forget me" or something like that. But he's still at peace because he feels that, well, maybe God has heard this.
It's very, I mean...
It works. I mean, you know, I'm not a religious figure, right?
That's what I was driving at.
Yeah, and my father was. And
yes, you have this very poignant scene when you, and you know, it's a fascinating inversion of the old argument that all male writers write books that are acts of parricide. You write a book that is in a way an act of resurrection, and it's very poignant about your relationship with your father, and it must have been incredibly hard to write about his illness and death. And then you have this marvelous scene where you go to Varanasi and you, with his ashes, and the Pandit takes you out on the Ganges, and you know, in accordance with Hindu ritual. And it has, without giving too much away, you and I share, among many other things, the distinction of having contracted giardia by drinking from the Ganges.
Yes. Yes.
And when you got to that bit, I thought, he's not going to really. But you did. And you say in an aside, I hadn't considered parasites.
Right, I premedicated before going on this religious experience with antibiotics, but I had forgotten about the parasites.
I premedicated with a large chillum of hashish before I said it was equally inefficacious, I have to say. But you have this very poignant moment, and in a way at that point, and you do it very deftly, you resile from the religion of your foremothers and forefathers. You step back from it, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, my father was wanting me to spread his ashes, and my sister and my mother, on the Ganges because he was a devout Hindu, and in Hinduism, you go through the cycle of constant rebirth and birth and rebirth. But if your ashes are spread on the Ganges, you will arrive to nirvana. You will rise essentially to heaven and be broken from that cycle. It's called Moksha. Now, it's hard for me not to listen to that story as my parents tried to raise me Hindu in rural Ohio where I grew up, and it just didn't work out that well. And so on the one hand, it was this incredibly moving experience enacting this ritual that has been done for thousands of years, and I really did feel it was connecting him to something larger than him and something larger than I was, which is that, there are many things he'd started in his life that he was not going to complete, and our generation now has to, and he completed things in his life that previous generations started, and that goes back in a chain going back thousands of years, and you can literally feel it and see it in this city, Varanasi, this ancient city of spires, one of the oldest cities in the world. I mean, amazing. And then this other part of me that says, come on, just because we bring the ashes to the Ganges, that therefore his deal is he goes to heaven, but otherwise this never would have happened. I can't make sense of it myself. So in the meantime, I'm also going to take the medication and avoid the bacteria and not the Giardia, as it turned out. And so it's navigating between this idea that, there is something larger than what we are, and for me, that's the very human connection of what our bonds are as a society. But for him, and for Ivan Illich, connected at this other metaphysical level too, and I'm very comfortable with that, and I believe that's important for many people in their lives.
Okay, one final point I've just got to get off my chest. You're, again, very subtle and precise in your discussion of that really, in my view, dreadful euphemism, assisted dying. And it is a dreadful euphemism. I think you're wary, as I am, of the medicalization of even that. Because, of course, what is it? It's the medicalization of suicide. Do you object to suicide? I mean, surely if we had a culture in which we were Stoics, in the Roman sense, we'd have none of these problems.
Yeah.
When we received a fatal diagnosis from a medic in good standing, we'd simply take ourselves off to the bath with a cutthroat razor, say goodbye to everybody. What would be wrong with that?
I'm still grappling with this because I got an email just today from somebody who wrote me saying that they have a brother who's in his 20s, who has severe depression, has gone through multiple rounds of treatment, has spent the last several years basically in terrible psychic pain. He's undergone electroshock therapy. It has not gotten better. And he asked her for permission that if he took his life, would it be okay? And she writes to me and says, do I say it's okay that he has that release?
So you've got to say whether it's okay or not.
So I've got to either not respond to this email.
I think it went into my spam folder.
Exactly. And what I come down to is that I think we are heartless if we face people who have unbearable suffering in their life and are unwilling to offer them the permission to hasten their death. But I also think that every one of those represents a failure of us as a civilized society. That that if we are unable to alleviate suffering like that, then we have to discover how to do it. This debate is going on in India, where there's an assisted death kind of law that's under debate. And when I come out of surgery there, I've done visiting surgery positions, people are only given Tylenol when they go home after orthopedic surgery or abdominal surgery. If you have a cancer and you're going through terminal cancer at home, you can't get access often to narcotic medications. So if you are faced with horrendous pain and all they're giving you is a Tylenol, or you can have assistance with your suicide, well, yeah, you'd take the suicide, if it was going nowhere. But it should be regarded as a total failure because we have not provided that basic medication. And the last thing I'll say on this is, in the Netherlands, the most common reason now that people are choosing euthanasia, and it's now up to almost 4% of the population that choose their exit path that way, is not because of physical suffering, is not because of bodily suffering. The biggest reason now is because they're concerned that they're a burden on their family.
And that's worrying.
And that bothers me tremendously. So, I want to fight for that elderly person in the Netherlands or that depressed person who says there's nothing left, to say, have we got something left? Can I honestly say there's a reason why you should have some hope? Or that there is some reason why you can arrive at a greater good coming out of even living with that suffering. But if we can't, it's hard not to write back to that woman and say, you should not feel that you're breaking a bond by saying that it's okay.
Well, on that slightly somber note, perhaps we could, I don't know if we can bring the house lights up a little bit so that I can, yeah, that's great, thank you. There are 2 roving mics. If you'd like to ask Atul a question,
There's one up there. I see it's going up.
Raise, and there's a mic up in the gallery, and it's already traveling. Fire away,
Okay.
gallery person.
Is that working? You've spoken really, really eloquently about the heroism of doctors and the idea of the heroism in the medical profession. I wonder if you had anything to say tonight on the sort of fetishization of sufferers as having to be heroes, having to fight to the end. If you don't fight, you've failed.
Yeah.
We use those awful cliches, and I wonder, you've almost put the argument, it seems to me, for the right to a boring death. But is there a wider cultural issue with families having to remember people as fighters, as warriors, as going into battle against disease, whereas actually we could, I don't know, a negotiated compromise, I don't know.
Yeah, one of the things that I think I am attempting to do in the book is to renegotiate what we think fighting for life is about. So fighting for the idea that it's just longer no matter what is a really empty idea. Fighting for what the priorities of a patient is, of a person is, regardless of what might be happening in their life, what they're up against, I think is a different story. So, my father, when we had this conversation, I asked him, I said, what outcomes are unacceptable to you? What are you willing to sacrifice? What are you not willing to sacrifice? And I mentioned along the way a colleague whose father said, look, if I can eat chocolate ice cream and watch football on television, that's good enough for me. And my dad said, no way that's good enough for me. For him, he's a surgeon and a control freak, but also a really social person. And what he wanted to know was that he could connect with and interact with people, that he'd be together enough that he could see people regularly. Even on hospice, he ended up having a dinner party about once a week. He wanted to be able to have email and Skype with other people and stay connected to family back in his home village. He had founded a college there, and he wanted to see it continue to thrive and prosper. He wanted to know it was going to be okay afterwards. And those were his priorities. And then if he couldn't have that, then just make sure he had pain under control. Now, when he explained all that, I knew what we were fighting for. We weren't just fighting for more time for him. We were fighting for his ability to have those functions and capacities, and then as they diminished, shifting to then fighting for, well, if you can't have that, just make sure there's pain control. And as the story unfolds, we didn't always succeed, and we disagreed at times as a family. You talked about what was hard about writing about my father's case. I didn't find it hard to write about the physical nature of what happened to him, or even about some of his suffering. What I found it hard to write about was the conflict within the family, about what we each thought should be done. My mother at one point called an ambulance, and I didn't think she should have called the ambulance. And, my sister felt I was too ready to accept his death. And I felt bad writing about that because I get to tell the story in my own way and make them drudge up all these memories that are hard. And then I'm telling the story. It's not their story, and they don't have that control over it. So I think that's the painful part. But back to their point, I think it's to try to reframe the idea that you can be fighting for something with these capabilities. It's just you're not fighting for the impossible.
But all of that rhetoric, does come from, the war, the battle against cancer, the heroic, it all comes from the patient's projection onto the medical authority of this heroism. It's intimately bound up with, and at another point in the book you talk about, in response to, when you're writing about Stephen Jay Gould's essay, you talk about the long statistical tail, and how that's where we're all fighting to be in, isn't it? If you look at a standard deviation, we all want to be the outlier.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to be in the tight bunch there.
No one wants to be normal.
I'm going to stop. I'm going to go on. Somebody else down here. Yes, there we go.
Yes, I confess, Atul, I haven't read your book yet, so I might be behind the 8 ball on this question, but let me ask it nonetheless. You prompted me to...
Everyone else here, though, is ready.
Right, okay. You've prompted me to get it. This is about the background is there's a particular issue here around codification of dying through the Liverpool care pathway you might be familiar with. It worked an absolute treat for my mother-in-law, but nonetheless, it's kind of been used and abused in other cases and now abandoned. The context is that there is occasionally people read about a case before the General Medical Council of a doctor, usually a GP, pulled in front of them for prescribing over and above to help the individual down to meet their end. And this happened at a particular time when I was working with a group of doctors, and we had dinner in the evening, and it was a table conversation. The GP next to me turned to me and said, "You know, John, I've never successfully killed a patient." Now, I was somewhat taken aback, but I said, well, look, just tease that one out for me a bit. And it's this halfway house between you have the codification of the Liverpool care pathway and you have the short trip to Switzerland. And this middle bit about it's a conversation between the family about how are you going to help them, and it's all coded. What are your views on that kind of middle ground where you have that type of conversation and you try and help the family through that?
I think I understand all the things you're talking about, a lot wrapped up in there. One of this is this idea of people sometimes call it the double intention of giving narcotic pain medication to people who are in their last days, that it is something that can relieve your suffering when you feel really short of breath and can relieve that sensation, also relieve pain, but it may also slow your breathing and hasten death. Now, part of it is that over time, when we've studied people who have palliative care or hospice care that provides that capability, on average, they don't live shorter than others, that in many ways they do live longer. And so I feel like it's less the black hood of death coming in the form of a morphine injection, but families nonetheless are incredibly afraid of it. So I do describe in the book that my father, when we give him enough pain medication to combat his pain, at times would stop breathing. And that was a moment when my mom called an ambulance. And when he got to the hospital, what did they do? They gave him the antidote to the narcotics. He woke up, and he was in pain. And he's in his own hospital now. He's a surgeon. This is his hospital. He knows everybody there. And he says to them, "Give me my pain medication." And they won't. They give him a little tiny dose, like, "Okay, we'll give you a little of this." And he finally signs himself out, furious after 8 hours or so, and whispers to me, "I don't trust Mom. You give me enough pain medication that I am not going to have another moment like that." And, it's a painful thing because people around you can think you're contributing to the death. I didn't think I was contributing to death. I just thought I was contributing to comfort, and whatever happens, happens along the way. But there are people who get prosecuted sometimes in these instances. There's an American case right now where a family member gave morphine to help combat pain and ended up going to being arrested.
Have things slightly changed? Because as far as I was aware, back in the day, the American Medical Association at one point had this view of specifically opiate-based painkillers, that they were kind of inadmissible because of the war on drugs, effectively, as it was then. And that was a big stimulus in the States to the development of synthetic opioids as painkillers, which you now, of course, have a huge addiction problem with.
Oh, yes.
How we laughed. And that there is a genuine problem in the American medical system with people having to sue doctors over withholding pain. I don't think we have that problem in quite the same way here.
Yeah, so it's a weird two-faced kind of view of things. On the one hand, we're getting better and better at providing enough pain medication towards for people in severe pain, but there is now this enormous fear that has come from prescription opiates, prescription narcotics being the fastest growing and one of the biggest sources of drug addiction in the country. And many of these places are coming through pill mills that you'll see doctors who are a very small number account for a huge number of the prescriptions, 1,000 narcotic prescriptions a week, that kind of thing. And so you get these funny situations where some people, for their pain, need massive amounts of drugs. I mean, I had a patient with sickle cell anemia, not fatal, but it can be so enormously painful that I emptied our pharmacy's entire drug stock of Dilaudid, a narcotic, in order to get her pain under control. And people started to think I was trying to kill her. And we unloaded the whole stock in one day, and it was the first time in weeks that she finally felt good. And then we had to figure out how to get more from the area in the region and so on. The Liverpool Care Pathway point is that the Liverpool Care Pathway was, here's a protocol that involves, we need to have conversations with people who are very sick about what their wishes are for the end of life, what their priorities are. And there are certain drug doses that are available that are prescribed for dealing with if they have anxiety, if they have trouble breathing, if they have narcotics. It worked beautifully in Liverpool, worked beautifully for people like your mother-in-law. But when it was scaled around the country, we hadn't worked out how to make it something that we really taught. And it became an implementation problem because people dropped the conversation part. They just gave the drugs with very little understanding of what people's priorities are. And then there was a huge backlash because some family members thought, oh my God, you're putting my mother to death. It was that same discussion that we were experiencing in my own family about what really was happening here. And so it
But there is a certain,
got abandoned.
I think what you're drawing our attention to is that there is a certain kind of, I'm not going to say fatal ambiguity, there is a certain kind of willed ambiguity about the Liverpool pathway, isn't there, that is enshrined in it. So, for example, when my mother was dying of cancer and the cancer hit the meningeal fluid in her spine, so she effectively lost her mind, she was taken into hospital, and I said to, in the NHS it used to be called a quality of life decision, and, I basically said to the nursing staff, could you kill her, please? Which they duly did. But of course, they didn't say it like that. But we all knew what we were talking about. So in a way, the Liverpool Care Pathway is a social construction. It's not a medical construction, isn't it? It's very interesting. You say, the point is the talking, and that's what you emphasize in Being Mortal. This is about connectedness, isn't it?
And understanding intention. So here's your mother-in-law. She comes in. She is fighting for very little at this point. And if there's the slightest bit discomfort, it does give everybody the reason, in some ways you would call it even an excuse, to be able to give sufficient narcotic that she's not going to have this issue anymore. Now, it remains debated whether giving that narcotic actually shuts down the breathing completely or not. My father had so many things that were shutting down his body at that point, whether the narcotic was the final thing that tipped the edge, or the pneumonia he had, or the tumor encroaching on his brainstem starting to stop the breathing. We were contributing in some way. That nurse was probably contributing in some way. And you were comfortable as a family saying, we know she's not coming out and this is the way it's coming to an end. But it is this mix of the social construction and the medical technology.
Could we have another question?
There's
Somebody at the back of the gallery, there's lots of people at the back of the gallery.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to say that you write very beautifully, and as a doctor, a lot of your stories have really moved me and changed my practice. But you also are very driven by statistics and RCTs and evidence-based medicine. And I wonder if really the thing that we're struggling with in medicine at the moment is the didactic between evidence-based medicine and perhaps our false worship of that, and the sort of new emergence of narrative research and narrative-based medicine.
Well, what you're getting at is that on the one hand, I run a research laboratory and we do lots of trials, and I have great faith in the work that comes out of that. But I also know very well that there's large volumes of experience that will never be captured in those trials. And I really was influenced by 19th century case studies that helped add a tremendous amount of knowledge about what really goes on in people's experience and in what happens. And a single case can upend your entire idea of whether your theory is right or wrong. And the person who sort of inspired me the most in this regard was reading Oliver Sacks when he started coming out with his books in the 1990s, because he was basically engaging in a kind of science of what is the experience of neurological illness, and that richness of description would be valuable not only to the common person out in the world, but even to his own profession. And I'm constantly, my desire to pull these lessons out and to tell the stories is out of a faith that that if it's helping me understand what's going on, I hope it is helping people both inside and outside the profession, and that might give some credibility to the idea that narrative, the story of what happens, and trying to tell the truth of what the story of that experience is, can be very important and powerful. That's why people like, I got to request who I might have be my interviewer, and I asked for someone like Will Self, because I feel like I asked for Will Self.
Surely if anybody's sui generis, it's me.
And ask for Will Self because it is the idea that you can probe experience and bring truth out of it that actually helps people.
But I think, the point you're raising here is, and it's interesting to hear you talk about Sacks, because and it's far more obvious that you can do this with something like neurology, because what Sacks does is to write a purely phenomenological account. So he gives equal weight to every element of psychic content. Now, in a sense, I think what you're trying to draw Atul's attention to is that he kind of doesn't do that quite. You are still slightly concerned to present an evidence-based argument. Is that because you think your readers might not be ready to abandon those paradigms as completely as you might be? Or is it because there seems some ambiguity about how you feel about that?
I think it reflects more my ambiguity than what I'm trying to draw out of the reader. I think there are ways of knowing, and that the story, the case study, has enormous richness and answers certain kinds of questions. It also can suggest theories and ideas, and you can sometimes test them with go to another case. But other times you have to go to the data. You have to look at, well, what is the experience at large? What do statistics and things tell you? And they have to incorporate into your story. So I'm often toggling between the micro and explain in incredible detail, the phenomenology of whether this holds up. But then wanting to go to the macro and, what's happening. I go into what's happening to the structure of families as our economies become dependent on people getting to travel and work wherever they want. That I couldn't put together just by telling a single story. I would have to, to be credible that this phenomenon is happening in 19th century America, 18th century Britain, and 21st century India. I can tell those pieces, but I've got to knit them together with more than that.
I would love to drill down into that, because I think in many ways that's the kind of nub of a lot of this, but we will have to wait till we're in bed.
Use another question to get there.
Yeah, could we have another question maybe from, yes, there's somebody here.
I'm Jonathan Tomlinson. I've written a review of doctors' narratives about their serious illnesses, especially when they're facing death. And there are three stories 30 years apart, one from 1952 written by Henry Sigarist, the great medical historian, and one from 1982 by a young doctor who had metastatic testicular cancer, and another one from Kieran Sweeney, who was a professor of general practice. And all of them had very serious illnesses which showed up on their chest x-rays. All of them were in hospital, and none of the doctors would tell them what was wrong. They mostly fudged and said, well, it looks fine, sir, usually, and sent them home. And so the last case was in 2012, and you can watch a video of Kieran Sweeney reading the letter at home. And he says, I got home and on the kitchen table I had the discharge summary, and it said, diagnosis, mesothelioma, patient informed. And it was the first time I heard of it. And at that point, he starts crying. And the reason I bring it up is because all of these stories have been written down as in educational format for young doctors to teach them about telling the truth and about facing mortality with their patients. And between 1952 and 2012, nothing has changed. They're still writing these stories and they're still saying the same thing. How can we change that?
I think what's changed is that in 1952, we knew we were not telling them the truth. We're doctor knows best, and we may not tell, we didn't want to worry your pretty little heads about what might be going on. We didn't think you could handle the truth. And we will just tell you, here's what we're going to do. In the present day, we think that we are giving you the truth. We will tell you, well, we can't cure it, but we can treat it. Well, you have a condition that has, and we feel we're being direct. After those meetings where he felt nothing was said, very often the doctor will feel that, whew, I really laid that one on the line. I hope he's taking it okay. I think we have very different perceptions because we have enormous anxiety about having a patient feel more pain or more anxiety because of something that we might say.
Well, you're very good. You write very well about overstepping that, Mark, in a sense, what you're talking about, which is asking for a culture of much, much more openness and directness about these matters. But you give a very good example when that openness really wasn't helpful and actually set up a bad dynamic.
Yeah, I toggled. So I became very aware of this. The book is sort of this iterative process of saying, okay, I'm learning from people about what I should be doing, so then I start being more frank with people. I had a colon cancer patient who was in her 40s, and we had operated for an ovarian cyst, and we get in and we found that it was an ovarian cancer that was spread throughout her body, blocking her bowel. I had to remove a section of her bowel. I come in to tell her the consequences of what we found, and I decide I'm going to be straight about what happened. And I did no setup for it. And so I told her that, that she was going to die from this condition, and that, the time can be 2 to 3 years. We hope for potentially a little bit more, but probably not better than that. And she felt like I'd taken a sledgehammer and brought it directly down upon her. And that she still remembered, 2-3 years later, how much she kind of hated me for that. And I feel like I mishandled it. But the answer wasn't that I don't give her the news. The answer is that you have to titrate it out over time. You have a relationship over time. You have to build trust. And, it was bad enough news that she'd woken up and she's missing part of her colon and that she had an ovarian cancer. She wasn't yet asking, how long do I have to live? I think there's the process of walking through it that later on I got better at along the way.
Can we have another question?
There's an extraordinary phrase or line in a poem by Danny Abbs about his father, what his father told Danny. His father was, in the early days of surgery, an operating theatre assistant. And he was at an operation when a brain tumor was being done under some kind of anesthetic, early anesthetic. And while they were digging away in the person's head, the person said, "Leave my soul alone." And everybody drew back and stopped operating, and then he seemed to be still under the anesthetic, so they went on. He said it again, "Leave my soul alone," and then he died. And it just has another dimension which I don't understand, and it seems to have been a bit lost from whatever we're talking about now. And I wondered if anything like that had come your way, either of you?
Well, no one muttering on the table, "Leave my soul alone," no. But the notion of soul and what it might be to tend to people's souls, I grapple with a little bit in the midst of the book, which is where I think this concept that people do have priorities besides just living longer, and that we can get so finely focused. This is going back to the beginning. We talked about, where a writer and a surgeon similar, that you can get so focused on the detail, the beauty of the organ, the chance, can I take a little bit more out? Can I deal with doing just a bit more? That you, if you've never clarified in the beginning, what is really important in this person's life? What are they willing to sacrifice? What are they not willing to sacrifice? Then you don't even know really what you're doing, what you're fighting for when you're in there, and especially when things start to go awry and you find yourself in unexpected, tricky territory.
One more. Got a woman at the back there.
Hi. I was struck by your discussion of legalized euthanasia and the concern that people were choosing, perhaps more often than not, to avoid the suffering of their loved ones. And I have a recent family experience that makes me wonder, is that so bad? If you ask people in their last months or weeks of life what they want and they choose to avoid inflicting more suffering on their loved ones, who are we to say that's not the right decision for them?
Yeah, it's complicated. When you ask about a person who is wanting to end their life because they fear that they're a burden on someone, that's because they're often disabled. They need help to get along. And it is around this idea that we have that I think is a little bit of a mistake, that the good life is a healthy and independent life. We feel guilty about being dependent, and we feel that this is not a natural state, when in fact it is a natural state. It is a common course for ourselves, and the fact that we as societies have not prepared for this. So the book starts with the story of my 110-year-old grandfather dying in a village in India, in a village of thatched mud huts. My family is farmers in that town. And for 20 years, he needed 24-hour care. He needed help with cleaning and bathing. He needed help with being fed. And yet he was still mentally intact enough that he could be involved in, people brought him, wanted to seek his advice on business decisions. He would be brought, to ask for advice about marriages. He sat at the head of the table every night. And it was taken for granted that his life was a good life. He did not regard himself as a burden on the family. Now, the truth of the matter is we're not nostalgic for that worldview. The reason it worked was it enslaved young women. They were the people who were the caregivers, and it was taken for granted that was their lot in life. And even it sort of enslaved the young men who weren't so young anymore. You can imagine being the 80-year-old uncle, the son, still waiting to discover when he's going to inherit land and actually have some economic independence from their dad. There are lots of reasons why when people got economic prosperity, they split apart and didn't want to live with dad anymore and necessarily take care of them. But in this world where therefore you feel guilty about just living and needing help, I spend an unexpected amount of time in the book describing worlds that can live with the fact that economic progress comes from giving young people freedom to live and work where they want, but using some of that prosperity to ensure we have communities, and some of this is that communitarianism idea that you talked about, communities where, yes, you can be in a wheelchair, but you can still have purpose and a meaningful life, and that should not be deprived of people. And so that's the sense in which I worry greatly about a society that says, what's wrong with, let me end my life because now I'm just a weakened thing and I'm a burden on this society. That's a troubling place to be.
Yeah, I mean, what you seem to be saying there is neoliberalism is fine when you're young and vigorous, but you need social democracy as you get older. And I'm all for that. I think we've slightly exceeded our time limit, and it's no surprise because Atul is such a eloquent and not a word I use often. Actually, I'm not going to use it. Lovely guy. He's a lovely guy. He'll be around for a while to sign some books. He'll probably chat a little bit more. But if you could please give it up for Atul Gawande.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.